Okay, hey everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming tonight. We got a fun program ahead for us. At least I think it's fun. I like things like amphibians and that sort of thing. Okay, so we're the Charlotte Wildlife Stewards. We're the Charlotte chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. My name is Donna Bowles and I'm president. And we have several of our leadership team here tonight. Raise your hands so everybody can see who you are. All right, so those people help make everything happen. So I'm really thankful for my leadership team and all the things that we can get done. I also want to express my thanks to Stewards Baptist Church. They generously allow us to use this space for our programs, and also we have our leadership team meetings here and some other events we've had on their property, and they are just very generous with us. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram if you're on social media. We also have a newsletter that goes out every month, and Jessie is our wonderful newsletter writer. She does a great job with that. And so that has our upcoming events, volunteer opportunities, and that sort of thing. So our mission is to create, protect, and preserve wildlife habitat through education, engagement, and enjoyment. So everything we do is about conservation. I don't know how to get rid of that off my screen. Okay, so one of the things that we want to do is to protect biodiversity. And there are several ways we can do that, but to kind of highlight a few is to plant native species of plants. That's because our insects and our other invertebrates have evolved with these, and insects are the foundation of our ecosystem. So we really want to support them. They're beautiful, they adapt well to our climate, they're a lot easier to take care of. The other thing is to remove invasive species. So as you can do it in your own yard, go ahead and take some of those out as you're able to and replace them with native. If you can't do that, then still just add natives. And then you can support conservation efforts, and the way to do that is to volunteer. You can donate to our chapter, North Carolina Wildlife Federation, or any conservation group of your choice, and that helps us all get the work done. So I want to highlight the Butterfly Highway tonight. My t-shirt. So North Carolina Wildlife Federation has just launched t-shirts through Bonfire, and if you're getting their newsletters, if you scroll all the way down, there's a place where you can go on and order them. They have several different styles, colors, and all that sort of thing. Anyway, so
yeah, hoodies, t-shirts, not just t-shirts, hoodies. There's all kinds of stuff on there. Great Christmas gifts, and all the money goes back to conservation.
Yeah, so that's really cool. So the Butterfly Highway is a program of North Carolina Wildlife Federation, and it's to promote having pollinator habitat, whether it's pots on a patio or a balcony to acres if you have that. But anything you can put in is going to help have these pit stops, because one of the problems that wildlife has, even flying wildlife, is you need to have corridors that they can travel through and that they can find what they need to do that safely. And the pictures that are on here, so November 3rd, a couple weeks ago, we installed a pollinator habitat. And you can see some of the pictures here. We put in 89 different, well, it was how many species?
It was 13 species.
13 species.
Actually, it was 15 species representing 13 genera, 89 total.
Yeah. So, it'll take a couple years. Well, the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. So, it's going to look good next spring, but it's really going to be in its glory in 2 more seasons. And you can get on the Butterfly Highway. I put the website up there. You can't see it, but if you just type in NCWF Butterfly Highway, it will take you to the website. You can also sign up for the newsletter that comes out every other week. Alden writes that, and it features what's either flying or blooming. Usually what's blooming, what pollinators might be flying or overwintering. It'll have something about one of the animal species. It has something about invasives and then other good information on there. So here's another way to support conservation. I already mentioned volunteering. You saw in that picture our group of volunteers. It was, it's a lot of fun. It's a fun way to get to know people too. We had in that group, we had a high school student all the way up to me and Connie, just the whole age range. So that was really cool. You can also join our chapter. You can do that through the North Carolina Wildlife Federation website. You just click on join up in the right corner, and just make sure you choose our chapter from the drop down box. Like I mentioned earlier, you can also make a donation to our chapter. And use sustainable practices. That one over there, I don't know if you can tell, that's a compost bin in my yard, and that eventually ends up to be about this much soil, but it's really nice stuff. So that's one of the ways you can practice sustainability. And of course, we've always mentioned leaving the leaves, native plants, get a rain barrel if you can, if that'll work into your plans. That's a really good way to conserve water. So we do have a volunteer opportunity coming up on November 23rd. This is in collaboration with Creek Relief and the Charlotte Tree Fund. We're all working together. We're going to be putting in trees and shrubbery on the Stewart Creek Greenway. The sign up for that, it's on our Facebook page. It's also been in our newsletter and in the NCWF newsletter. So you can find the link there if you want to sign up. Also, if you're available on Friday morning from 9 to 12, we also are going to be placing the trees and shrubs in their planting areas. So if you're available to do that, we could probably use a few extra hands for that. And then we don't have a program in December. We all sort of take a break. We do have a leadership meeting, but December's busy, so we don't do much. But in January, we're changing it up a little bit. Instead of having a program like this, we're going to have a social time with wildlife trivia. So you have time to do your reading and look at webinars and all that sort of thing. It's going to be at the Sugar Creek Brewing Company. We'll have a drink ticket for everybody that comes, and we'll have some little things to munch on, as well as just spending time with other people that love wildlife and conservation and that sort of thing. On January 26th, we will have a nesting box workshop. This year, we're going to make nuthatch boxes. And the reason for that is that nuthatches are a species of concern. So, everybody wants bluebirds and loves bluebirds, and they're fabulous and beautiful. They've actually recovered. And part of it probably is because of the efforts that people have made to provide places for them to nest. But nuthatches, we need to focus on them a little bit. And right now it's scheduled to be here. That may change, and we'll have that all worked out before we send out the sign up for that. We do have a limit of 20 people. So if you want to do it, don't delay when the sign up is. Now we're good. Okay.
I just want to acknowledge the folks online. There's about 23 people online all over the state, from Brunswick County, Huntersville. There's some folks in South Carolina. So thanks for tuning in. If you guys have any issues or questions, you can just put that in the chat. And so just thank you for being here online tonight.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, and I want to make sure, did everybody get a raffle ticket? Because we will have a raffle at the end, and we'll have a chance to get raffle tickets if you didn't get one already. So so do stick around for the raffle. We've got a bucket hat and a nice little NCWF tumbler. So I'm going to turn it over to Kira McEntire. I had the pleasure of meeting Kira last year at the Carolina Raptor Center's STEAM on the Wing and Water Day, and asked her if she would, do a program for us, and she said yes. She also had a really interesting booth at our Kids in Nature Day in October, and I think the kids really love seeing all the little critters. Sakir is an assistant professor of biology at Queen's University in Charlotte. She's been studying amphibians for 15 years. And she's passionate about teaching and sharing that knowledge. Her current, huh?
She was joking that it was since I was 5.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was thinking too. Her research is currently on the marbled salamander populations and ecology. And so I'd asked her to talk about wetlands because a lot of people don't really, I think people think about a swamp when you think about a wetland. And that seems like, oh, we don't want swamps or whatever, but wetlands are really an important ecosystem, and they have a lot of services to us. And so anyway, and then of course we wanted to talk about amphibians too. So anyway, so Kira, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, and hello to everyone online. I'm gonna just reshare some slides here. Let's see if it will start from the beginning. We got online?
There's one other step, so we can see the same. Go to display settings and duplicate.
There we go. All right,
Yep,
excellent.
perfect.
Cool. All right. So yes, I often like to start with little jokes. This one was created by a group called Wild Green Memes for Ecological Fiends. If you don't follow it, I highly recommend. It's on Facebook and Instagram. They're good. So examples of different wetlands. A marsh, Shrek doesn't live there. A bog, Shrek doesn't live there. A fen, Shrek doesn't live there. But a swamp, that's where Shrek lives. So just so we're clear. All right, so some key features of a wetland is that you have wet or flooded soils that is caused by the local hydrology. Hydrology is the study of just how the water moves. It's predominantly anaerobic soil conditions. This means that it's low in oxygen. So they are relatively harsh environments for a lot of species. You don't see certain animals there or plants, but other ones do really well in that area. But you have these really special adaptations to deal with things like wet feet, if you want to think about that for plants with the flooded soils, and then not a lot of oxygen in the soil either. So there is the flora and fauna that's adapted to those conditions. You have really unique systems in them. So while we started with a little joke, we actually do have those 4 different types of wetlands. So those are the different names for them. There are marshes, swamps, bogs, and fens. And we will go over kind of what are the key features of those different wetlands. Has anyone heard of all of those terms before? What one was new? Fens. Yeah, fens is kind of an unusual one. I think one of the interesting things that I learned about when I was doing some research about wetlands is that the marshes, swamps, and bogs and fens all have different characteristics. So it's not just all the same word for a wetland. They actually are kind of different. So marshes are kind of your stereotypical wetlands. This is what you think of when you think of a wetland, kind of a boggy area, wet area that has some plants. There are 2 main types. There are non-tidal, which means that it's not being affected by the ocean. So the marshes are also found along the coastal regions. And so some of them are tidal, meaning that they actually do have a little bit of saltwater influx sometimes, and the water level can change depending on the tide. But non-tidal can vary in depth from a few inches to a few feet. You can typically find them in around other bodies of water in shallow depressions. The tidal ones are along coastlines. These can be freshwater, brackish, meaning it's a mix of saltwater and freshwater, or they can be completely saltwater. But ultimately they are influenced by the tide. So the water level is going to change similar to the tide in response to the moon, if you want to get into all of that. Most of them receive their water from surface sources. So this is not true for all types of wetlands, so that's an important note. Some famous examples are the Everglades. That is a really famous marsh. And then vernal pools. I haven't heard of a vernal pool before. If you grew up a little bit more north, you may have heard that term. I also hear the term ephemeral wetland, which is the one that I use more commonly. This is where I do my research. So there are actually a lot of vernal pools, ephemeral wetlands here in Charlotte. Basically what that means is that they are temporary. So right now, they are mostly dry. I'm saying mostly because they filled early this year with Hurricane Helene, but they did dry out again. And they usually fill at the end of November to December around here. It varies year to year, depends on rainfall, because again, you're getting that surface water. But that's kind of how ephemeral wetlands work. They're full for part of the year, usually about November until about May, June is when they start drying out around here. This year they kept water a little bit longer, which meant the mosquitoes were real bad. But anyway, so marshes. Swamps are a wetland dominated by woody plants. So when you have mostly the big trees, those are your swamps. So again, if you think of Shrek lives in a swamp. It can be forested or even shrubby. It's often flooded and usually has slow moving water. So this is one of the ones that I think about, like the bio, just kind of like drifting through these big trees with the huge roots. That's kind of what I think of for swamps. So movie sets, it's often what we use for wetlands, are the swamps. And then another really cool kind of swamp is a mangrove swamp. So mangroves are these really awesome trees that live in coastal areas that are tolerant to salt conditions. And they are really important habitats for a lot of different species, especially for fish during their breeding and early development stages. Bogs are peat deposits that have acidic water and sphagnum moss. The water is primarily from precipitation. They're really low in nutrients, which means we have a lot of specialized plants that are adapted to low nutrients. Does anyone know what some of those are? Yeah, Venus flytraps and pitcher plues, plants, and sundews. Yes, so all of our carnivorous plants are adapted to places like bogs. They do really well in that low nutrient environment because they can get their nutrients from elsewhere by eating other critters or decomposing leaves and things like that. So they can form by filling in a lake or a pond or even a water retention pond, things like that with sphagnum moss. So they don't often have a lot of standing water. It's more that they are just very, very wet. They can have standing water, but that's not necessarily required. Locally, they're relatively local, as in to North Carolina. We have a special type called moccasins, which is typically covered in trees and evergreen shrubs on a shallow water table. So these are found in the mountains. Again, these are areas that have really wet soil. So you might take a step and suddenly there's water around your foot, but you don't necessarily see standing water. These are really cool systems. You have a lot of really unique animals that live there, things like bog turtles and amphibians, all kinds. Really like these mossy areas. All right, the one you hadn't heard of, fens. So fens are another type of bog that's kind of similar to a bog. It's peat forming. Typically receives water from surface drainage and groundwater. It has more nutrients than a bog. So that's the main difference between the two, but they look really similar surface level. They can become a bog if the peat builds up too much that you don't have access to the groundwater source anymore and you start depleting the nutrients. But when you do have access to the groundwater, then you have a little bit more overturn in the water table, which is going to change the amount of nutrients that are available. So those are the four main types of wetlands. Before we talk about conservation concerns, are there any questions? Yes.
Term peat all my life, but what is peat? How does it form?
Oh, good question. I don't know how long it takes. I definitely cannot answer that question. My understanding of peat is that it's very dense vegetative matter, but someone else might actually be able to answer this better than me. No? We would have to look it up.
It forms in those anaerobic anoxic conditions, right? So it
Yeah.
doesn't really take a long time to break down. And then so you actually have peat bogs on in the eastern part of North Carolina. Yeah, so basically it's anaerobic conditions where organic matter drops and forms slowly like under pressure in a very wet environment. Very organic. Yeah.
Thank you. That is not my specialty, so I appreciate the assist there. Was there a question in the chat?
Oh, just, make sure.
Yeah. The question was about peat formation. It's just not my specialty. Sorry about that, guys. So yeah. What was the question?
Where this swamp, does it have, or any of these swamps, do they have other areas like the bogs and such? Do they have, I mean, it's not just like a pure swamp or a pure bog or something, right? There are marginal regions that are transitional some.
Yes. So the question was, are things like a marsh just a marsh, or do they have these transitional zones that might have other types of wetlands around them? Absolutely. Especially things like, so swamps are slow moving water, but around the edges of swamps, you might have marshes where you have these depressions that fill with water, but the water's not moving anymore and it may be more open, things like that. Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. It's very rare that you have ecosystems that are completely just like isolated. There are usually transition zones between them. Yeah, great question. Okay. So let's talk about some conservation concerns. Quick thing about if you find a turtle crossing the road, because it's kind of related, a lot of them live around wetlands. First, to understand why it's crossing, there's a few reasons. They could be trying to find a mate, they could be trying to find a place to lay their eggs, or they could be dispersing to new habitats. It is helpful to get them off of the road if it is safe for you to do so. So if there's a lot of traffic, it is not safe for you to do so. But the best thing that you can try to do is keep it going in the same direction that it was already moving in. It is less likely than to turn around and try to keep going back to where it was trying to go in the first place. You should try not to flip it over because its internal organs are attached to the back of its shell, and if you flip it over, they can come detached, and that's not good. Not feel good at all. Try to keep your hands away from its face because they will potentially try to bite you as a defense mechanism. And don't necessarily move it to a completely different area because they will often try to go home. Those are some other things to keep in mind. Some things like snapping turtles, you really want to keep your fingers away from them. If you absolutely have to, you might just kind of nudge it from behind, but really keep your hands away. Those can break finger. So watch out for snapping turtles. They have pointy faces. It's very easy to see that they have a big beak. All right, so some of you guys may already know some of this information since conservation is such a big emphasis of this group, but I do have in here just kind of some basics of what is conservation biology, which is the study of conservation. So this is an interdisciplinary crisis response field. It was developed in the 1980s in response to people noticing, hey, a bunch of species are disappearing. What is going on? And so that's why we developed conservation biology. It's inherently value driven, and that big value is valuing biodiversity, valuing the preservation and maintenance of biodiversity. So yes, main focus is preserving biodiversity. There are some really big threats that come up, especially for things like wetlands and amphibians. Climate change is a big one, and habitat destruction and degradation is another really big one. There are a lot of different approaches to understanding conservation. This is why it's interdisciplinary. So some other things that might be important are things like sociology, understanding how people are interacting with the spaces. Things like economics, how much is it gonna cost to try and protect the space? Or how much is it gonna cost if we lose the space, right? There's all these different factors at play. Politics, of course, are involved as well. But one part of it is that ecological component of trying to understand where are all of these species and what are they doing and how can we try and help them stick around. So why are wetlands of conservation concern? Anyone already know this?
flood, they absorb the water.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of a wetland is that when you have a big flood, it helps keep all of the soil from washing away. Absolutely true. Anything else? It acts as a filter, yeah. So it's really great about removing things like toxins from the water. The water that comes out of a wetland is actually really clean. They are nature's filters.
A lot of the critters.
Yeah, so wetlands can act as sort of a nursery where other species are growing there and then moving out into the environment and maybe being eaten somewhere else. Amphibians are a great example of that, actually. Frogs are really well known for doing that. Yeah,
Biodiversity.
yes, biodiversity, absolutely. So they're also a concern because they are threatened. So they are really high in biodiversity. They also have high endemism. So endemism means that there are species that are only found in that area. Carnivorous plants, great example of that. They're only found in bogs. That's it. Well, the ones in the United States. There are some that live in trees elsewhere, but the ones here are the ones that are found in bogs. And they're also highly threatened. So people tend to want to be where wetlands are. These are in often areas that are just really popular to live. They're good climate. It might be near the ocean, which we love the view. It's just a nice place to be. So we've lost about 50% of wetlands estimated worldwide. So this is why there are conservation concerns. We've already lost so many. And then, of course, they have those ecosystem services you guys mentioned. They've got the water filtration and they can help prevent damage from flooding. They're also uniquely susceptible to damage, which we will break down a little bit more. So why do wetlands have really high biodiversity? One potential reason is something called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So if you have really frequent disturbances, not a lot of species are going to be able to survive in that area because it's just too hard. They can survive a disturbance, but then they have another one, and then they have another one, and then they have another one. It just gets really hard. If you don't have any disturbance at all, there's no room for any new species to come in. Whatever's there is established and nothing is going to change. A lot of wetlands have this like intermediate disturbance where there's a little bit of change, which allows new species to come in, but it's not so much that nothing can survive. So this is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Some of the disturbances is just the change in water level. So because a lot of them are related either to tides or to rainfall, things like that, it's going to change throughout the year. And so that can be a disturbance depending on what you are adapted to and what you can survive. In general, they also have very high productivity. So there is a lot of nutrients for things like swamps and marshes, and a lot of detritus. Detritus is dead plant matter or animal matter, things that are decomposing. As things decompose, that's when we have the nutrient cycling starting over again. So then there's a lot of things available. This is a picture of a mangrove, half underwater and half above. Took that over 10 years ago when I studied abroad, which is kind of fun. It's also a stopover spot for migratory species. So a lot of birds will pass through and butterflies and things like that. Temporary wetlands are really great for opportunistic species. So things like amphibians often take advantage of them, but they're not the only ones. There's also a lot of invertebrates that take advantage of those temporary pools. A lot of birds will stop by, a lot of mammals, things like that, especially to eat the amphibians that happen to be reproducing there. It's a big part of it. There's also a lot of habitat structure. And so that promotes biodiversity because it creates a lot of places for species to live or to hide and be protected from other species. So mangroves are a great example of this because their roots create this sort of matrix system that allows smaller things to hide and get protection from predators. Also a lot of surface area for things like sponges and algae to grow on and things like that. So it just creates a whole lot of habitat for other species. They also have really high endemism. meaning again that they are a unique species to that area, partially because it is kind of a hard life in a wetland. Those of you guys who garden, you probably know that some of your plants don't like to have wet feet. They have too wet feet, they're just like, no, I can't do it, right? So like a lot of species don't like that. So you have to have species that can tolerate that. They have to be able to tolerate disturbance or a lot of changes in that amount of water that's available. Because the soil is anaerobic, that's gonna change what species are able to survive there. In the areas that are more acidic, also some species just can't tolerate that amount of acidity. In the marine and tidal wetlands, you have to be able to tolerate salt. Again, if you're a gardener, you probably know that a lot of your plants do not like salt. Most plants can't handle it. And then it has to do with osmotic balance and things like that, which I can explain if anyone really wants me to, but I think you'd rather see pictures of amphibians that we're getting to, so I'll leave that now. A lot of areas also have limited nutrients. So things like nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting factors for your plants. Again, if you ever have to fertilize your plants, you probably know this from gardening. And so you have to be able to tolerate really low levels of those, or you have to get them from somewhere else, like the carnivorous plants who get them by digesting insects, which have higher levels of nitrogen. And they can be really isolated. So isolation leads to high endemism because species can't get from one bog to another one. And so the ones at one bog are going to be different than the ones at a different bog just because they are far apart. So what that is called is local adaptations. So species are locally adapted to whatever the situation is where they're currently living. So some threats that wetlands face include drainage and filling it in for things like agriculture or housing developments. I don't know if any of you guys are aware or work at all with the Catawba Land Conservancy, that they have a protected wetland in the middle of a development. It's actually where I do a lot of research. And that happened because they were kind of filling in that whole area. They were building all these houses and they were like, oh, there's this wetland here. And they were able to grab that land and protect it, which is really amazing. I don't know what the area is called. It's on Whitehall Park Road. Is that the river district? I don't know. Okay. I don't know the name of it. So yes, they're in areas because we like to grow things there and they're relatively flat. And so we want to build houses there. Why you would want to build it on an area that likes to flood, I don't know, but you know what? It happens. They're also very prone to invasive species. So invasive species are non-native species that typically that come in and grow really, really fast. And so because they can grow really, really fast, they can kind of take over an area. Because wetlands have that disturbance, that provides an opportunity for new species to come in. Unfortunately, sometimes those are invasive species. And so then they can kind of take over. Once an invasive species becomes established, it's really, really hard to get rid of it. One of the ones that I know we're struggling with in a lot of places around here is privet, just kind of a shrubby little thing. Yeah, that one's real rough. It takes over, drinks a lot of water, not helpful. You can have salt invasion of coastal areas that were fresh water. So as sea levels are rising, you're getting sort of this influx of salt in areas that used to be fresh water. This also happens with hurricanes. Hurricane storm surges can flood wetlands that were freshwater and make them salty. And as we talked about, a lot of animals and a lot of plants don't like salt. So you put it in an area that was fresh water and suddenly it's salty. They aren't adapted to that, and so they can't survive very well. And then, of course, climate change in general. One of the biggest challenges of climate change is that it's causing a lot of variation and a lot more intensity in disturbances and storms. And so we're getting more intensive flooding or, you know, entire landslides. Western Carolina, we are still thinking about you. And just changes to the hydrology in general. Just at the urban wetlands that I was mentioning earlier, I've seen highly variable weather patterns, water patterns from year to year, really depending on how much rain we're getting. So one year it'll be really wet, the next year it'll be really dry, I think it was like 2022, the water didn't even fill until like February or March. Usually it's November, so that was really weird. And then, you get hurricanes where it fills early and then it dries out and it's just kind of messy. So having that changes to hydrology can be really difficult for plants and animals to deal with. Yeah.
But also, state legislatures that change the definition.
So the question was, isn't a threat also the change in state legislature which changed the definition of wetlands? Yes, that is also another potential problem. Yep. They used to be more protected than they are now because of that definition. I believe the definition now, oh gosh, please correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone happens to know more about this than I do, but I believe they changed the definition to be it has to be connected to a moving waterway now in some way, shape, or form, whereas it didn't used to have to be. And we talked about there's a lot of those that are not connected to moving waterways. So yeah, it's a big deal. Thank you for that. Yeah.
That's that. Policy.
Absolutely. Yep. So this question of why are wetlands particularly susceptible to damage? Also just point out what is happening in this picture. There is a very large fish in the very middle of that picture, and there is a school of, I believe, all of their babies right behind it. That's what that dark mass is. So just to tell you what's happening in that picture. They already have frequent disturbance. So we talked about one of the things that can be really challenging when you think about the intermediate disturbance hypothesis and biodiversity is that intermediate disturbance is best. They already have frequent disturbance. If we make it more frequent, we're going to lose species because a lot of things just can't handle that often of a disturbance. There's no time to recover and rest and get strong again to be able to withstand another one. They're also very low lying. This means that they're gathering water from their surrounded area, which can accumulate runoff from other activities. This can include things like extra nutrients, which can cause algal blooms. This can include extra toxins, which can be problematic. They do act as a filter to a certain extent, but if you put in too much, there's only so much that they can handle. So restoration is one option, right, to try and protect these areas. The U.S. wetlands are protected by the Clean Water Act, again, not quite as much as they used to be. You can destroy a wetland, but you have to offset it in some way, usually through restoration activities, which changes where the wetlands are found. So what we're seeing is this shift in geography where it's like, oh, we'll put a wetland here because it's more convenient for people. Okay. I guess. And restoration is difficult because it involves a lot of money, it involves a lot of time, investment, and it also is a really big test on how much we actually understand how the wetland system works. So even if you put all the plants back that were in there before, if you happen to know, which you may not, because it may have been destroyed before anyone recorded what was there, it may not miraculously become a flourishing system. There may be some missing piece that we just don't quite understand yet. So this question of can we recreate a functioning wetland? To a certain extent, they have done this in places. So yes, we can make it function like a wetland. Will it be the same as what it was? Probably not. So it's kind of there's only so much we can do, but we can do something. So not all is lost. And of course, there's protections. So some things to think about as you try to go about restoring a wetland is you have to think about the hydrology, you have to think about the plants, you have to hope the animals will return. It helps if there are populations nearby, especially those populations that are mobile, so the ones that can move. Tree frogs actually are really good at recolonizing an area. Before everyone came in, someone was telling me they just put in a pond. They will probably have tree frogs in the spring because they're very good at finding any little bit of water. Yeah. How do you know if it's successful? That's one of the big tests, right? Like, when are you done with the restoration effort? That can be one of the challenges and can be one of the things that costs so much money over time. is you might have to continue planting more plants and continue making those efforts, removing invasives, things like that. All right, any questions about conservation concerns before we just look at some fun pictures and listen to some frog calls? Yes. That's a great question. So the question was, are there any benchmarks that are set to figure out if a wetland is restored or not, and how are they set? A lot of times it is people will go into a project and say, we are going to restore it for 10 years. So that's how long they do it. It's often controlled by how much money you have and how long you can continue the project. But people will look to things like services. So do we have water filtration now that we didn't have before? Okay, then that is successful. I don't know if there is like a specific governing body that sets that sort of standard, because I don't do that. So maybe, but I think it's fairly individualistic. Yes.
There's a water. That owns like local. Water.
For those of you online, Waterkeeper Alliance, in case you didn't hear that. All right, so I am a biologist and I study amphibians. So I wanted to show you guys what are some of the more common local amphibians here. A lot of them are associated with wetlands, and so we'll talk about which ones are which. I will tell you some fun facts, and yeah, let's get into it. So what is an amphibian? Who knows the answer to this question? Yes. It is a cold-blooded animal. That's absolutely true. Anything else?
Born in water, live on land.
Yeah, so amphibian means two lives. So often they are born in water and live on land. They are both aquatic and terrestrial. However, many of them are completely terrestrial. So they have kind of been like, nah, I need to be near water, but I don't actually need to be in it. But most of them still have this biphasic lifestyle where they're living in these two different areas. They mostly have relatively smooth skin, meaning they don't have scales. Think about other cold-blooded creatures. And they do need water to survive. Many of them actually breathe through their skin. Some of them breathe entirely through their skin. About 70% of salamanders are lungless, so they breathe entirely through their skin, which is pretty wild. The main groups are salamanders, frogs, and caecilians. So salamanders and frogs are the more common ones. Caecilians really only live in the tropics, and they mostly are burrowers. I got to see my first one ever in Ecuador last December, and it was amazing, and I didn't even get a picture because I was so excited. But it was so cool. They look kind of like worms, but when you know what they are, it's very exciting. So where do amphibians live? In wetlands, yeah, absolutely. Wetlands, ponds, streams, seeps, caves, forests, pretty much anywhere that is relatively wet. If you've got water, you've probably got amphibians. They are found all over North Carolina. They are found all over the world, but since we're talking about North Carolina, you can find them pretty much everywhere. They are nocturnal, meaning they are mostly active during the nighttime. This is one way that they can try and not lose as much water because it's not as hot. You will occasionally see some out and about during the day, especially if they're in a body of water, like bullfrogs will still be out during the day and cricket frogs will as well. But generally you can find them under rocks and logs. So if you haven't seen a salamander before, for example, that is totally fair. You kind of have to look for them because they're generally not out and about. In the picture, by the way, you can see it has a teeny tiny little hand. It's regenerating its limb. So it's regrowing its little foot, and it's just so cute. Some of them migrate to and from water sources every year. Others move less than a meter their entire lives. So you've got quite a wide range of things going on there. They're highly abundant. There are a lot of amphibians around, especially salamanders in Western North Carolina. So what do amphibians do? Why do we care about amphibians other than they're adorable? They're carnivores. They mostly eat insects. Got lucky enough to catch this picture of one eating, carrying off a moth and slightly tripping over itself. It was very adorable. They move nutrients between aquatic and terrestrial systems. So we kind of mentioned this earlier. They often are a food source for a lot of other species, especially baby frogs. They're kind of like popcorn whenever they're coming out of the ponds all at once en masse. Frogs lay a lot of eggs at once, most species do. And so because of that, as they're developing in aquatic systems during their larval stage, they're getting nutrients from the aquatic system, then they move into the terrestrial system. So they're moving it there. Then when the females lay their eggs in the aquatic systems, some of them are gonna die, some of them are gonna get eaten. So they're moving nutrients into those systems. So you get this sort of back and forth. They're relatively long-lived. So many of them will live about 10 years. Some of them have been known to live up to 30 years. Just pretty wild. Yeah. This is especially true for salamanders. Not all frogs will live quite that long, but specifically salamanders will live a very long time. They're also known for regulating carbon cycles. Because they are so long-lived, they hold on to carbon in their bodies for a relatively long amount of time, which also reduces, and they also reduce decomposition of leaf litters, because they're eating all the insects that are breaking down the leaves. So that means when you have salamanders, the leaf litter will last a little bit longer, which acts to insulate, it creates habitat. There's a lot of different reasons that's helpful. Also, stores more carbon because the insects aren't releasing the carbon quite as quickly during decomposition. There's also medical interest in salamanders and frogs, amphibians in general. Many species of salamanders are known to be able to regenerate their limbs. We saw a picture of one of them doing it. So there's a lot of research done on axolotls, specifically looking at regeneration, trying to understand what is the cellular process there, how can they do that, because it's absolutely insane. And then there are a lot of species of plethodontids that also have antifungal bacteria on their skin. So most plethodontids, which are the lungless amphibians that live over in the mountains, there's a few of them here as well, but most of them live in the mountains. They have parental care. So when they lay their eggs, they will hang out with their eggs. And it turns out if they abandon their eggs, they will almost immediately die from fungal infections because the mothers have antifungal bacteria on their skin. So they are protecting the eggs from those fungal infections by sticking around them. I know, it's so cool. All right, so conservation concerns for amphibians. That's a really tiny one. Amphibians are known as the canary in the coal mine. So if you're familiar with that phrase, canaries used to be taken down to coal mines because they were sensitive to carbon monoxide. If it got too high, the canary would die before humans would. So they'd be like, oh, we need to get out. So because a lot of amphibians are dying off, about 30 to 40% of them are endangered. A lot of people are like, huh, maybe something's wrong. So they are known for that because they have relatively thin skin. They are sensitive to environmental changes. They're of course sensitive to climate change as well. They have relatively limited thermal ranges because they are ectotherms. They can't change their own body temperature except for by moving from place to place. So they are kind of whatever temperature it is outside is really what temperature they are. Also, of course, because of things like disturbance and getting more flooding or landslides is going to be problematic. Land use change is another conservation concern for amphibians. We've lost 50% of wetlands worldwide. If they live in wetlands, that's the problem. Habitat loss in general. They're also vulnerable to diseases. So there have been a couple of pretty bad scares recently. I say recently, but in the past 20 years. And probably about 2005 is when one of the worst ones really started. And it was something called BD, which is a fungal infection, Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, if you wanted to know. But it's just called BD, and it is killing a lot of frogs. So we found out that it attacks the keratin in their skin, and it messes with their sodium-potassium balance, which actually just gives them a heart attack. So we've seen really massive die-offs. We saw it just kind of spread down South America in like 2009, or down Central America, and it just killed pretty much everything. We do have it in the United States as well. Bullfrogs are a carrier of it, but a lot of the frogs in the United States seem to be less vulnerable to it, so they seem to be able to survive it, which is pretty cool. There was another one that happened in 2010, it was a little later than that, like 2014. In Europe, it was called B. sal. It's a very similar fungal infection that kills the salamanders. There were these really bad lesions happening on fire salamanders in Europe. Interestingly, though, the United States actually took this threat really seriously and proactively, I know, put in a law to make it illegal to move salamanders across state borders, specifically plethodons, which are one of the more common ones, because they were found to be potentially vulnerable to the disease. So the thought was if we reduce the movement of them, maybe once it gets here, it won't spread quite as quickly. Yeah. Who knew? We can do things proactively. Awesome. There's some other diseases that can cause problems, but those have been the big ones that have been tied to climate change. All right. What amphibians do you guys already know about? What have you seen? Tree frogs. Yeah. Bullfrogs. So skinks are reptiles. Yeah, they've got scales. They're just really, really small, so they kind of look like salamanders. Yeah. Yep. Chorus frogs. Yeah. They're really loud. Were there any in the chat?
Salamander,
2-line salamander.
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of bird, but it's still the juveniles.
Mm-hmm. Those were probably 2 lines, but there are a couple other possibilities. So according to iNaturalist, there are 24 species of amphibians in Mecklenburg County. We're going to talk about half of them because some of these are not quite as common as some of the other ones. So you've got about 8 species of salamanders, marbled, spotted, duskies, 2 lines, 3 lines, slimies, and reds, and newts. And then there's a whole bunch of frogs. So we're going to look at some pictures of some of them. We're not going to get into all of them because most of them you aren't going to see. Yeah. The endangered ones are going to be listed through the IUCN Red List. Yeah. Yep. The toads might be. The question was, are any of them psychedelic? The toads might be, but I don't know. There's a lot of cool lore attached with toads. We'll get into it when we look at the toad. Okay, salamanders. So we're gonna start with my personal favorite, which are marbled salamanders. And personal favorite just because that's what I'm studying right now. So marbled salamanders, we've got one up here as well that we can take a look at after this. They do have an aquatic life cycle and they have this beautiful black and white pattern. That picture sort of near the middle, I'm gonna move my mouse so hopefully you guys can see it. This one, do you see all those little balls underneath it? Those are eggs. Yeah. So marbled salamanders lay their eggs in the fall when the ephemeral wetlands are dry. This year, they laid them a little early because of Hurricane Helene. They were like, oh, the water's here. I guess I better lay my eggs. So a lot of them laid them kind of along the edges of the wetland. Hopefully they will fill again. Depends on how much water we get. Historically, there was another record of a hurricane causing breeding to happen along the edges of the water whenever it filled early, and those did not make it. So it's just kind of a matter of whether the water shows up or not. Some of the populations I've been monitoring, they are starting to look a little dry. So hopefully we get some more rain this week and that helps them out, but we'll see what happens. It changes from year to year. So the reason... I mean, I probably could artificially keep it wet, but that's a lot of work. Yeah, keeping it wet would help, just kind of keeping it damp but not completely submerged. One of the challenges with these guys is if they actually have done studies that found they don't usually lay their eggs in the deepest part of the wetland because that is more likely to fill and then dry out. And if it fills, they will hatch. If they hatch and it dries out again, they will die. Because once they hatch, they need water. They look like this. They have those fluffy little gills. So they are really, really cool because of that breeding time. The reason that they've adapted to that breeding time is because they often co-occur with spotted salamanders. And spotted salamanders are bigger than marbled salamanders. So marbled salamanders are only about yay big, whereas spotteds, you can see on my hand, are a bit bigger. So spotted salamanders lay their eggs in the spring or late winter, so January, February to even into March, depending on the weather. And if they were to lay their eggs at the same time as the marbleds, the spotteds would eat all the marbleds. Spotteds are bigger than the marbleds. So instead, the marbleds lay their eggs in the fall, then they grow all winter, and then they eat all of the spotteds. So it's okay if the marbleds have a bad year, because then the spotteds will have a good year. So like there's balance in that competitive interaction. So these are spotted salamanders. They are spotted. We're very creative in naming things. This is what their egg masses look like. They've got these really thick jelly masses. You can see them in ponds in early spring. One of the coolest things about spotted salamanders is you see how the eggs are green. They're actually photosynthetic vertebrates. So they have an association with an algae called Ulophila something. And they get oxygen from the algae and they get some carbohydrates from the algae whenever they're in their larval state, when they're developing as embryos. And they get some nutrients from the waste products of the embryos. They have found DNA of the algae in the reproductive tract of the female, which suggests that it might be passed down from the adults. So they may actually retain some of this, and it doesn't seem to be colonizing from the water, which is really wild. Yeah, it's a really cool system. I could talk more about it, but there are really good videos on YouTube. So there's a really cool video that talks about photosynthetic salamanders. I recommend it. It explains the whole thing. They're very cool. They're very cool. But if you see this really thick jelly coating around an egg mass, it's probably salamanders, not frogs.
I have a question in the chat back up to marbled salamanders from Mary. They lay early and it doesn't stay wet and the eggs die. Will they lay eggs again? Thank you.
I don't know of any records of that. Typically, they invest all of their energy into one reproductive event. There may be a few individuals that decided not to lay, and so they may have laid a little bit later, but I haven't seen any new egg masses since mid-October. Yeah, this year.
Question from Lauren. Is that considered resource partitioning?
It is resource partitioning, yeah. But it's also competition. It's more competition. They're mostly just eating each other. So the thing about salamanders is they will eat anything that moves and can fit in their mouth. They're not picky. So yes, in the springtime, if you see these egg masses that have that super thick jelly coating, those are probably salamanders, not frogs. Another one that can be found in this area are called dusky salamanders. They are generally kind of brown. They are of the species Desvenathus. The actual species recently changed because we are still figuring out which species are where. Some key features to identify if you have a Desvenathus salamander are the back legs are going to be chunkier than the front legs. You got more stocky back legs. They have this little light stripe on their face, on their cheek, between their eye, down the side of their chin. So those are some of the big things that you can tell that that is a Desvenathus salamander. These are somewhat sensitive to urbanization, so you're going to find them in more rural areas more likely. However, these guys are very tolerant of urbanization. So two-lined salamanders, we actually found one in Freedom Park, the creek in Freedom Park. Yeah, I found one in there one time when students were looking for macroinvertebrates. So they're around. They're very cute. They have two lines down their back. Pretty easy to tell. These pictures were taken in the mountains of Western North Carolina, so they are a bit more vibrant. The ones around here tend to be a little more brown. They aren't necessarily quite as bright yellow. The males will get these little projections on their chins during breeding season. Those are called cirri. Looks like they have a little mustache. But they use that to detect hormones to try and find the females a little bit easier. They are generally stream breeders, so they will migrate back and forth to the streams. They do move around a lot. They're pretty slender. Yeah, the two lines really give it away. So that's how you know what they are. White spotted slimy salamanders are the ones we've got here in Charlotte. Both of these pictures were taken here in Charlotte. I found them at Stevens Creek Nature Preserve. That's where I managed to find these guys. So we've got a juvenile, a really tiny one, and an adult. They're not super common, but they are around. Slimy salamanders are cool because they produce very, very sticky slime, like their name says. If you harass them enough, you will get stuff all over your hands. You have to scrape it off. It will not come off other than scraping it off. Very sticky. Yes. How do I find these guys? I flip over logs. Sometimes there are wasps under them, so. Oh, not even by the water. So these guys are totally terrestrial, so they aren't even found by the water. These are one of the plethodons. These are plethodontids, so they also don't have lungs. So yeah, these guys don't have lungs, and they're completely terrestrial, so they don't need to be near water. In fact, I don't find them in really boggy areas. They don't seem to like to have really wet feet, so to speak, thinking about our plant. My PhD advisor likes to tell a story of whenever they would run out of tape in the field, they would write labels for their petri dishes on paper and then wipe them on the back of a slimy salamander and stick them on. And the techs hated it because it was so hard to get it off. From experience though, it's just like peel and glue off. Very sticky. But I try not to harass them. Yeah. One of the things about slimy salamanders is there are about 12 or so species along the East Coast and a few into like Alabama and Texas area. They all look like this. They're all black with white spots. So to know what species you have to know where you are, because how we know what they are is genetic differences. So otherwise, they all pretty much look like this. Some of them have a bit more white on their sides. Some of the back flecks look a little gold, but like it's black and white. That's what they look like. They're really cute. I like them. Little stars. Did I see questions in the chat? Yeah.
One question, referring to the slimy salamanders, when flipping logs, how do you protect the salamander?
It won't be harmed by you lifting it up. Don't want to keep it exposed for too long. They're generally what we call negatively light phototaxic, meaning they will move away from light. When you are putting the log back, if you want to gently move it to the side and then let it crawl back under, that's one way you can do it. If you don't want to touch it, just be really gentle when you put the log back. You don't want to just like drop it. That would be potentially harmful. Yeah, so just being really gentle. Do be careful if you're flipping logs because there can be wasps and snakes that might try to bite you under them. So do be careful. Be aware. Yes, turn the log towards you, but also watch for wasps. I don't remember to. I'm like looking at the ground. Anyway, fine. Still alive. Last salamander to talk about are the eastern red-spotted newts. So this is what the adults look like. They're kind of brown. They are more aquatic. So newts are really cool, especially the species. They have what we call a triphasic life cycle because they are laid in water. They develop as larvae in water, then they lose their gills and they become that bright little toy over there. And then they run around on land for a while and then they come back to being mostly aquatic as adults. So they kind of go back and forth. So the adults, you can see, have a more flattened tail that's more water adapted, so they can swim a little bit easier, whereas the juveniles, which are those bright orange toys, just run around all the time. These are one that you will find running around during the day, especially if it's rainy. It looks like someone lost something. Who dropped this little toy? The salamander. This one you really don't want to lick. I know, it's so tempting. They have tetrodotoxin in their skin, and it can potentially kill you if you ingest enough of it. So yeah, don't lick them. Don't handle them with a giant cut on your hand. It's also a bad idea. But generally, if you just take a look at them, they're fine. You can still touch them, just don't put your finger in your mouth afterwards, right? Wash your hands, that sort of thing. But yeah, they're really cute. They're really, really cute. They're very bold because, again, they're super toxic. So there's like, you guys, no one's gonna eat me. It's fine. Can wander around whenever I want to. Yes. That's a great question. So the juveniles are typically, I'm trying to think for the people online, about 3 inches long. But the adults might be about 5. So they're not super big. They're pretty small. Yeah. There's questions back. The newts are more wetland pond dwellers. Yes, they are usually found in more still water. The question was, where do they like to be, moving or still water? Yeah.
What is the coloration part of the morning?
Yes. Yep. And in fact, they are the model organism for a lot of other salamanders. So we have a really cool mimicry system in North Carolina, mostly in the mountains, where you've got this bright red model organism, and then you have a lot of other organisms that are like, oh yeah, I also have red. I'm also dangerous. Definitely. Most of them are harmless. The red salamander, pseudotriton, does have a little bit of toxin. We recently learned it's a pseudotriton toxin. And so those are what we consider noxious, meaning they don't taste good, but it won't kill you like this one. So that is something called Müllerian mimicry, because they are reinforcing this idea that bright red means toxic, don't eat me. And then you've got your Batesian mimics that are like, yeah, no, totally, I'm toxic. Please don't eat me. Some of them are kind of sticky too, so you do got that going for them. Yeah. So the question was, have they been shown to have different levels of toxicity if they are terrestrial or aquatic as adults? I believe they are more toxic as juveniles when they are that bright coloration, but I would have to look into it. There are other newts that are known to have this toxicity, the California newts. They have a range of toxicity that is linked with some potential interactions with some snakes that are tolerant to their toxins. It's a really cool system. But there are geographic like hotspots where they're like really heckin' toxic, and then areas where like, just a little bit of toxin. So yeah, it's really fascinating. I don't know as much about these guys and their toxicity levels. I've read a lot more about the tetrodotoxins on the West Coast.
How do they compare with?
How do they compare with the pufferfish? I don't know. Nope. I'm not gonna try to guess on that one. There's a really cool story about the California newts. I don't know if it's true, urban legend, that they found out they were toxic because 4 grown men went on a camping trip and they scooped up water in their coffee pot and they made coffee. And then about 3 days later, they were all found dead with coffee still in their cups. And they looked in the coffee pot and there was a newt in it. I don't know if that's true. I think these guys are just as toxic. I know they are very toxic. I don't know how they compare to other species though. But yeah, it's a fun story. Yes. A difference between a newt and a salamander. A newt is a type of salamander. Yep. It's a square rectangle thing. Usually they have this sort of triphasic life cycle, but there are a bunch of other newts. It's just kind of like specific genera that are considered newts. Yeah. Yep.
There's one more question about salamanders
Yeah.
before we move on. Do birds eat salamanders?
Yes. Birds eat salamanders. Absolutely. Well, it wouldn't do very well if we tried to eat that one. Yes, it is considered one of their big predators. Probably another good reason why they're active at night, helps them survive that. Snakes are another one of their big predators. And then each other. Because again, if they fit in each other's mouth, politics.
um, why- which-
Question was when witches are using newts and toads, are they using these species? So the reason that we think, I think I even have the toad first. Look at me go. So the reason there are associations between newts and toads with witches is probably because they do produce toxins. And so those toxins may have been used in potions or in spells that might cause someone to have hallucinations. Potentially. Question.
Maybe like, now how snakes like use their venom.
Mm-hmm.
They do that.
So I know of at least one instance. The question was about if like snake venom is used to make medicine, what about frog amphibian toxins? I know of one instance of this. It's not with anything from the United States, dart frogs. So there is a dart frog that they have created a painkiller from that is like 200 times more powerful than morphine and doesn't have the side effects of morphine. And I've known about that since I was in 5th grade, so it's been around a long time. But I think they really only use it for patients that have chronic pain. Yeah. So I'm not sure about any other species, but that's one that I do know about. Yes. Many opportunities for studying. So that very nicely transitioned into our first frog, which is our Fowler's toad. Who's seen a Fowler's toad before? Yeah, these guys are super common. They look a lot like American toads. There's a couple different ways that you can tell them apart. One of them is the number of warts in their spots. They have 3. American toads don't. So that's kind of an easy one. You can see them a lot in early summer, late spring, as teeny tiny little babies. If you're ever around a pond around that time of year, the whole ground just moves. And it's usually just these little baby toads. They're very, very cute. For scale, each one of those squares is 1/4 of an inch. So they're very teeny, very teeny. And we will see if the video wants to work. And maybe we can hear. So you can hear the like, ah, scream. That's this guy. He's gonna call in a minute where you can hear him individually. So that's what they sound like. They sound like they're yelling into the abyss. I'm actually gonna play this again because there's another sound near the beginning that's more like a whoom, whoom. That's the bullfrog. I didn't have an individual video of that, so I'm gonna play this one again, maybe. Maybe. Right there. That whomp, 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 that's your bullfrog. All the screaming. Yeah, they're goofy. So they make sound by like pushing out their sides and extending their throat, which vibrates. Green tree frogs are another really loud, common critter in this area. They're green. And they have little toe pads where they've got really round toes. You might find them on your windows at night, and they do like to hang out in urban places. And they have this sort of yellowish white line down their sides. So that's another way that you can tell that they are green tree frogs. We do have a couple other species of tree frog that can be green sometimes, which is why it can get a little bit tricky, but if it also has that white line, then it is a green tree frog. And we will try to listen to that call as well. I think it sounds kind of like a duck. Yeah. Yeah. And that chorus in the background was deafening. And I mean that literally, like tree frogs call over 70 decibels. They will literally cause hearing damage. So like, don't hang out right next to a calling frog without protection. Yeah, they're wild. Who's heard or seen these guys before? Yeah, they're super common in this area. So other really common guy are the gray tree frogs. These can be really variable in color. So they can be kind of greenish and look a little bit mossy. They can be really dark brown. They can be kind of light brown. I have two of them over here. They can also change their color a little bit. So whenever I put those in the container, one of them was really, really pale and the other one was really dark. Now they're both really dark. So they responded to their background. They also seem to get darker when they're a little bit stressed. So moving them around will make them a little bit stressed, and so they will get darker. And all that is they're just changing the amount of melanin that's expressed in their skin so they can just sort of contract and release that melanin. They're not actually changing their pattern, so you can tell individuals apart based on that pattern. So we've got these guys too. I am almost positive you guys have heard this one. That one. Kind of sounds like someone's going down a comb. Yeah. Hands, how many people have seen or heard these guys? They're easier to hear than they are to see. They are really good at camouflage. This is one of the ones that can be green. So especially when they are juveniles, often they will come out of the water. They will be bright lime green or even kind of goldish in color, but they have this white cheek patch. That's one of the distinguishing features for them. They can turn brown pretty quickly. They can hang out as green for a little bit. I tried to do a study on it and I'm inconclusive. I don't really know why they're green. I don't know why they change. They did exactly opposite of what I expected, so I don't know. But they're cool. They're real cute. Are there questions or people just like excited?
Some comments, questions that I would like.
Okay,
I shared. So they could,
learn frog calls.
yeah, so they can hear about it.
Nice. Okay. American bullfrog. This is one that likes to hang out in my backyard. We have a juvenile one over here. They are chonky, so they can be this big. They can be quite large, bigger than the size of my hand for those of you online. I know my hand isn't very big, but I'm a small human. They can get huge. They will often hang out in really, really aquatic areas. So they've got really big back legs that are good for really big jumps. They've usually got a little bit of green around their face. They look really similar to green frogs. They make more of a womp womp sound, whereas green frogs sound more like a banjo, like a funk, funk. Yeah, funk, funk. So they do look a little bit different, but these guys will colonize pretty much anywhere that has water. I've had a pond for a couple years now. It didn't take them long to find it. So they're really common. They're big, they're fun. We do have a juvenile one over here if you want to take a look at it.
So question back to the gray tree frog. Grace says the juveniles sometimes resemble the green tree frog. I found a tiny one that looks like a green, but has a brown stripe instead of a white.
Yes. So when they first metamorphose, they can be bright green. I discovered this because I was doing a study with some students where we were looking at lily pads and the effect of lily pads on water temperature. Inconclusive results there. But right before we ended the study, suddenly I had like 1,000, 2,000 eggs. It's like, guys, why? We had just like these big Rubbermaid tubs of water, and they were like, cool, let's go. Anyway, and so when they started metamorphosing, 'cause I didn't know what kind of tadpoles I had some green ones and I had some gray ones, and I was like, cool, I have green and gray tree frogs, and then all the green ones turned brown. I was like, what? So yes, they can be green, and as you can kind of see in that really pale one, it's got kind of a greenish hue. Occasionally you will find adults that are green. There hasn't been a lot of studies about the distribution of that variation, so I don't know a lot about it just because no one has studied it. I tried to for a while, and then I was like, nah, we're going back to salamanders. It's too complicated. So yeah, they absolutely can be green or even like a little bit goldish. They're really cute. Shiny. Southern leopard frog's another one that you may have seen. They've got leopard spots. They also have these really distinct light stripes down their back. I saw this one at Whitehall Wetland 2 days ago. So that's where that one came from. They at the wetland owned by the Catawba Conservancy. They have a really pointy little face. They still have those big eyes and big ear pads and really big legs. They're jumpers. They're closely related, same genus as our bullfrogs. We also have pickerel frogs in this area, which look really similar, but these are a lot more common. These are probably the ones that you're seeing if you're seeing kind of a spotted looking frog. Cricket frogs. Cricket frogs are fun. They sound like marbles that are being clicked together. They will call during the day. They will call all the time, but they're really tiny. So you're looking at maybe an inch long, and they can be really variable in color. So I have 3 different color morphs on the page here. You can have some that have this bright green marks on their back, some of them that are mostly brown, and some that have sort of a reddish orange mark on their back. I don't know a lot about that either. I don't think anyone studied it, but they are highly variable. We see all 3 colors in a single population. It's probably just because any of these colors will help you hide, and so they work. So they can all survive and do pretty well. These are super abundant in pond areas. They are most active in the summer. That's when you'll hear that little click, 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 click sound, like marbles are being hit together. Cricket frogs, anyone seen those before? Yeah, 2 of you guys. I took a walk at Ribbon Walk Nature Preserve not too long ago, and there were a bunch of them just like hopping all along next to the path. So you do see these guys, and if it's not tiny toad season and you see a tiny frog, it's probably this one. Eastern narrowmouth toads are not super common, but I had some in my backyard this year, and so I wanted to share because they're also just really goofy. So narrowmouth toads have a very tiny face. So they have a narrow mouth, but they can be real round. Some of them are more orange on the back, some of them aren't. But they kind of sound like a sheep. Yeah. Yep. Real silly. But also you can't not smile when you hear that because it's just so absurd. And he was like, please stop shining a light on me. Awesome. Yeah, they sound like a sheep. Yeah, it's real silly. Really, really fun though. They're not very big. That's a full-grown adult. So even if you hear them, they're really hard to find. Especially if you're near like a creek or something where they have a lot of things to hide under. I had at least 3 of them in my backyard. I think I found 2 of them. So yeah, they're really hard to find, but they're so stinking cute. I just had to share. Also because the sound is absurd. Yes. Yes. great question. So the question was, is there a reason frogs make noises, and do they make noises for different reasons? So mostly they're trying to mate. They're being like, hey, I'm over here. That's mostly what they're doing. Occasionally they do have alarm calls as well. So you will have some of them. It's usually more of like a peep or like a chirp, really short calls that is like, danger. So if you're walking by a pond, you might hear some little chirps and a splash. So they're letting others know like there's something scary coming around. But mostly it's, hey, how you doing? Mostly what it is. Yep. I also actually heard some really unique calls from some of the gray tree frogs at my house this year. They were doing like a really weird, almost like a green tree frog little like chirp also. I don't know what that was about. It was like one individual that kept doing it. I have it on video now, which is exciting, but it was very weird. So there are some slight differences between individuals as well. I can't say that I can recognize the individuals at my house, but like you can tell that they're different. They do sound a little bit different from each other. Yeah. So there are other frogs, but most of those are a little bit less common to see. So I have a bonus wetland creature, and that's box turtles, because they're cute. So here's one hidden in the leaves. I'm honestly impressed that I saw it. So they have pretty good camouflage. And these were two individuals that we found on the same day. Does anyone know why they're called box turtles? Yeah. So most turtles, the front part of their body, that shell, part of their shell is called the plastron. For most of them, it is stable. It is one piece, it doesn't move. Box turtles have a hinge on their plastron where they can actually like pull it all the way closed, and they can tuck themselves inside and be like, nope, I'm a box. Cannot get inside, as long as they're not too fat. Sometimes they can't fit in their shells anymore. That also happens if people bring them into captivity and don't give them enough calcium when they're growing up, then their shells don't grow big enough for them to fit inside them. That is another potential. Because they're like 30% bone, which is way more than people. They're a lot of bone. Their shell is made of bone. So like, you don't get enough calcium, you can't build your bones. There's no room. Yeah, box turtles, they're cute. Yeah. Toads are a type of frog. It's another sort of square rectangle situation. So toads are mostly characterized by the length of their back legs, which are shorter. So they hop, whereas frogs have longer legs, so they jump. So that's the biggest thing. Oftentimes toads are found in slightly more terrestrial areas, so they might have more visible glands on their skin, which makes them look bumpy, which is why people think they have warts. Really, those are just glands. And no, they will not give you warts because that's a herpes virus, and it's not the same thing. Just to clarify. So yes, that is the main difference, is kind of where they're found. They tend to have more of them tend to have toxins. They have these big glands behind their eyeballs that have those toxins in them. But the biggest thing is their movement style. Yep, good question. Yes.
There's an app for frogs out like Merlin for not reliable.
Is there an app for frog calls like Merlin? No. And the reason there's not is because there's too much variation in frogs. So they haven't been able to develop that digital system for frogs to automatically categorize it yet, because then there's too much individual variation, and they have different calls at different times. I know some birds do too. It also might be just that not as much money has gone into it. So yeah, that could be part of it. And can I do it? No. I do some coding. I do some of that. I do teach a data analytics class. We learn R. I do statistics. I do agent-based models. I do not know how to do machine learning to, no, unfortunately, no. I would love it. It would be great, so helpful, but no. So my research is about marbled salamanders. What I'm currently trying to understand, so all of these have nests, they're all sitting on eggs there, is the impact of temperature on embryonic development. So there have been 2 studies that have looked at this for marbled salamanders. One of them was in 1939 at one temperature. The other one was published in 2020 for one population in Tennessee. That's all we know. That's all we know. And how this kind of got started actually is because of the polar vortex in 2022. Does anyone remember that happening in December? It dropped really, really cold. So my study site, I'm pretty sure, froze solid. It killed almost everything there, but not everything, which is where my research comes in. How in the heck did some of them survive that? So that's ultimately where I'm trying to go with this, is trying to understand sort of, can some of them tolerate freezing for a little while? Some preliminary unpublished studies suggest maybe they can, at least a small percentage of them can. But I want to know also, what long-term impact does that have? So if you experience this really stressful event as an embryo, does that have an impact on you later in life? Or that long-term trend? So right now we're just trying to get some baseline data about development rates with temperature, and then seeing if there are differences in behavior depending on what temperature you developed in. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know, still very preliminary, but that's kind of where we're going with it, both as a larval and as a juvenile, so post-metamorphic state as well. All right, I have a lot of questions about that. Question.
I'm just curious if you like,
If I've looked into the iguanas. So reptiles are really different than amphibians. There are a few species of amphibian that are known to survive freezing. Wood frogs are incredibly famous for this. They can be little frogsicles and then they can thaw out. We know how they do this too. They actually create a lot of what's called glycogen, which is a type of sugar. It's like an antifreeze in their cells. And what that does is it makes the ice crystals be really, really tiny. Because the problem with freezing is that ice crystals can pierce your cell membranes, which causes them to burst, which is why you get frostbite. We don't have that protection mechanism. So by keeping the ice crystals really, really tiny, then it doesn't cause that problem. And so that's how they're able to survive. There is no evidence to suggest these guys are doing this, but all of the studies that I have seen that talk about it are just like, yeah, they're vulnerable to freezing. There's no citation. No studies have actually been done, except for the one unpublished one that I found out about through networking. So yeah, it seems like probably they are vulnerable to freezing. Some of them will die, but some of them might be able to survive if it's short term enough. So yeah, time will tell. There were more questions. Yes. Is the study happening in a controlled environment or outside? I am recording the temperature of the nests that I find outside, but I am not monitoring them super often to try and reduce my disturbance on the nest. So I do take a few of the eggs into the lab, and then I am controlling what temperature they're experiencing. We are starting with stable temperatures. I'm really excited to move to variable temperatures to see how quickly they adjust to changes in temperature. Yes. Yep, there was another question over here.
like that, one, their natural setting. How can you tell follow larval progress? Is there any way this is from an egg?
So can I track the larva from what nest they came from? No. You can tell individuals apart based on the melanophores on their skin. Unfortunately, a lot of these juveniles are really, really dark, so it's really hard to tell them apart. Once they get their adult coloration, where they've got these black and white markings, I can tell individuals apart, so I can monitor the adults and the later juveniles. But when they're really tiny, it's nearly impossible. Yeah, unfortunately. Question.
They tend to stay in the area where they
Most amphibians, honestly, do actually stay pretty close to where they originated from. A lot of them will return to whatever pond they hatched from. A lot of them have what's called site fidelity, meaning they're loyal to that site. They will keep going back to that site. The marbled salamanders do move into the upland area, so they move away from the wetland in usually after the breeding season. So like in November-ish, they will just move back up. The urban wetlands, there's not a lot of places for them to go, so they just hang out there. I've seen the same individual from the end of November until the end of March under the same board. It just just hung out there in all season. Got bigger. That was cool. Yeah. So yes, they will stay relatively close. In general, amphibians will travel a decent amount of distance relative to their size, but they are small, so they're still not traveling super far as like people are concerned. So the question was, are some species migrating in response to temperature changes? Yes. So the biggest thing that has been recorded so far is species moving up in elevation. So this is causing some challenges for mountaintop endemics. So the species that are only found on mountaintops, they're kind of getting pushed off the mountaintop a little bit. Because as the species at the mid elevation are moving up to try and track the temperature and water changes, they're getting more competitive with the ones that were already there. And so it is causing some problems. Yeah. That, I'm sure there are some instances of it. I don't know of any off the top of my head. But to the extent that they are able to, they do have problems with roads. There are mass migrations of spotted salamanders that happen every year, and people will go out and try to protect them from being roadkill. We don't get a huge one down here just because the populations aren't that big. A group of salamanders is called a maelstrom, by the way, which is really metal. So roads cause a really big problem with trying to move, and then you've got the problem of them trying to have site fidelity, so they will try to go back to that same location. But I'm sure there are some examples of them moving. There are also examples of them being artificially moved. So there did not used to be green tree frogs in the Smoky Mountains, and now there are. Because people, they were in boat trailers probably. So yes, any other questions?
In the chat, room, there are 2 questions. I want to get their questions. First question is, can frog species hybridize, and does that affect their calls? Like how hybrid bird species kind of mesh their songs together?
Yeah. Yep, there are records in the Smokies actually of green and gray tree frogs hybridizing, and they have real funky calls. It sounds like it's somewhere between the two. It's real weird. Yeah.
And really quick, would the speaker share her favorite natural area near Charlotte?
Oh,
For activity?
I really like Stevens Creek for amphibians. That's where I've been able to find the spotteds, and I have seen 2 lines there as well. And there's usually lots of toads. Stevens Creek, yeah. I feel like it's underrated. Not a lot of people know about that one yet, so I like that one. Nice.
That is a wetland that stream system they restored.
Yep.
Checking that out. About their last question, do you know if beavers are being used in revitalizing wetlands in the eastern US?
I know beavers are killed in the eastern US because they're considered nuisance animals. I also saw one in a retention pond behind a Harris teeter by my house. Don't know what it was doing there. Very weird. I don't know. I do not know of any specific examples where people have used beavers for wetland restoration. That doesn't mean people haven't done it. I haven't heard of people doing
They're
it.
doing it out west.
They're doing it out west?
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I haven't heard of it yet in the east.
yeah, yeah. People more think of them as nuisances, unfortunately. Yeah. Question.
I think there might have been South Carolina. My grandma was talking about it. It was not happy about it.
Yeah, yeah. So for those of you online, there was perhaps hearsay of one in South Carolina, so perhaps. Yeah, perhaps.
Questions?
Yeah. If people want to come see the critters, you can come see the critters. Yeah.
So we're gonna sign off.
Thanks you guys for tuning in.